little bit of what he does. Right now he's working as a day program coordinator for Outward Bound in Philadelphia. And but he's going to be speaking about about his experience with his wife in Romania for 5 years. But here's a little bit about Jack. When he was a senior in college, I dropped him off, and he's basically talking to me about his girlfriend. He's probably about to get engaged. And he said, "Dad, so you remember Kelly went to this place in Romania last year for a semester?" I'm like, "Yeah." He said, they're recruiting her to come and work there for a couple of years as a volunteer. I said, "Okay." And she said, she kind of told him, like, "We're probably going to get engaged. You knew that, didn't you, Dad?" I'm like, "Yeah, I knew that." And he says, so they ask about me. And it's like, oh, he's like into running and rock climbing, and he's an art major, and he's all this, he's volunteered on this and that and the other. And they're like, "We want him too." He said, "So we're thinking about like getting married and then just going to live there for 2 or 3 years. And we'd have to fundraise to do it. What do you think?" And I thought very carefully for about 3 seconds and said, "You'd be crazy not to do that." So the coolest thing about Jack and Kelly is I think they're very thoughtful people about everything they do. And they learned a lot of that, hopefully from us, but also in college and then in their time in Romania, and they're still living it in many ways. So very excited to introduce my son, Jack Orkin.
Thanks, Dad. Paul, I'm sorry. Hello, everybody. My name is Jack. I grew up here in Kent. Can you all hear me okay? Should I stand closer to the microphone? Great. I don't do a whole lot of formal public speaking. I do a lot of very informal, semi-public speaking as part of my job. Oh, dear. Stand by, please. Thank you. Okay, I think that will work. Okay, all right, I'll just stand over here and I'll be slightly hunched. Okay, so, sorry this is taking so long. Great, I'll just do that. There we go. Can we hear? I'm not fumbling anymore. Great, okay, sorry about that. So folks, my name is Jack. I actually grew up just around the corner on Horning Road. Drove past this church a lot. My dad's been in Rotary for a long time. Yeah, I went to college in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And then, like my dad said, pretty quickly after graduation, my wife Kelly and I moved to a small town in the Carpathian Mountains in Romania because she had done a study abroad semester there. And they recruited her to be a volunteer for them. And fortunately, I had the right skills that they were also looking for. So that was a very fortuitous, privileged thing that we got to do. I'm really glad that we did it. Would not have made any other choice. Yeah, so my dad asked me to share with you all a little bit about my experience living there. And then just like a few takeaways from that time. So that's what I'm gonna do. So before I tell you about my experience in Romania, I really need to tell you about Romania, because my guess is that a lot of us don't know a whole lot about Romania. It doesn't really make the news a whole lot. We currently have troops going there because of Putin's aggression towards Ukraine. And Romania has been part of NATO for a while, but yeah, so a little tidbit about Romania in the news. Yes, so that's me and my wife, Kelly, in 2013. Yeah, so we moved to Lupeni, Romania in 2013. If you go to the next slide, this is the view from our apartment building. We were up on a 4th-story apartment building, looking out over the valley, pretty much. Lupeni was part of a string of coal mining towns in a place called the Jiu River Valley. And it's really beautiful, like one of the most, like easily the most beautiful place I've ever lived, probably will ever live in my life. It's just like surrounded by really green mountains. The town itself, if you can imagine like an Appalachian town here in the US, very similar in some ways. Like it's coal country. People moved there to work for coal and set up little shops and grocery stores, and that's pretty much it. So now that coal is being phased out as an energy source, lots of people are starting to move back to the places where their great grandparents were from. And so living there, there's a sense of like people are very proud of the place where they live and also are very kind of embarrassed about it. Like when I would tell people that I'm from the States, which I like always knew was going to unleash this flood of like, oh wow, what's it like in America? People would say like, I'm so sorry that you have to see our poverty here. And that always just made me feel sad that like, that was the thing that they thought stood out the most when like, it's beautiful. Things are rusting and falling apart, but it's also very beautiful. Okay, so I'm gonna make a lot of generalizations and a very quick history about Romania. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, so this is Romania. You can see there the Carpathian Mountains kind of curve through Romania in a backwards L. The portion of the country that's in the, kind of the upper left. I'm not gonna do cardinal directions because I always mix up west and east. Sorry, northwest portion, that's all called Transylvania. South is Oltenia, and the east is Moldova. So I know it's very, very small, but there's a black circle on the map. That's pretty much where we lived. So we lived right in the middle of a mountain valley. The Romanian people, their origin story is that they are born from the Dachans, who were the indigenous people who were living in this land for many, many thousands of years, and the Romans, who invaded the area in the 1st century AD and made it part of the Roman Empire. So because of that, Romanian is a Latin-based language. If you know Spanish or French or Italian, it's pretty easy to learn. We learned it with some difficulty, but definitely learned it. Yeah, so quick poll of the room. What do you all know about Romania? Just shout it out. Dracula. Anything else? That's okay. Adina's from Romania. Yeah, cool. What I knew about Romania before I went there was Dracula and about, I'd heard stories of Romanian orphans being adopted in the US. And Nadia Komenic, we love Nadia. Yeah, actually from the town that you're from, kind of. From the town that you're from, Târgu. Yeah. Okay, so very brief history of Romania. So Romans invaded the area. The Romanian people lived there. They were conquered by the Hungarians. They were conquered by the Ottoman Empire. They were conquered at one point by the Russian Empire. Romania has typically been not the conqueror in the area. They have been in the middle of the great powers. And some people would say that that's given kind of a national consciousness of having to accept their fate in a lot of ways and to just kind of like deal with life as hard and as somebody else having more power than you do, because they were always the ones who were being conquered. Just to scratch the vampire itch, we can go to the next slide. Hey, there he is. That's Dracula, or Dracula. So this is Vlad Țepeș, Vlad the Impaler. He was a an Oltenian prince during the time that the Ottomans were in charge of that part of the country. He was born in captivity. He learned a lot of really violent and oppressive tactics that the Ottomans used against all the people they conquered. He used them in Romania and against the Ottomans. And yeah, just kind of an example of like a leader who is Romanian, but also was very cruel to his people, which we will get to later. So we're gonna skip ahead. We're gonna skip a lot of history. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, the next big leader in Romanian history is Nicolae Ceausescu. I bet a lot of you have heard about Ceausescu. Yeah, so he and his wife Elena were the last communist authoritarians in Romania. So after World War II, the Soviet army liberated Romania from Nazi control and then set up a communist dictatorship. Ceausescu had a lot of very strong ideas about being a leader. one of which was that he wanted to pay off the national debt, and he did that by imposing strict austerity measures, which starved and froze lots of Romanians. And then he also was really into having a large and therefore strong population, and so therefore outlawed abortion and birth control. So that's in large part where a lot of the orphanages were filled from, was people getting, having a kid and then realizing they couldn't take care of the kid, leaving the kid in the hospital, and then the state would have to take care of all of these kids. And the orphanages are a lot smaller than they used to be, but they still exist. And there's some very sad and scary stories from those. So besides those two main initiatives that Ceausescu was into, the secret police was also a staple in every authoritarian government. And their main activities that I was told about was that they would coerce Romanians to inform on each other. Neighbors would inform on each other, spouses would inform on each other, kids would inform on their parents. Orthodox priests were coerced into informing on their congregations when they would go to confession. And what that did was it kept the government abreast of any dissent, but also just made people not trust each other because you never knew what somebody was going to say about you. And the secret police had files and files and files on people. What the secret police also did was they enforced a no gathering policy. If Romanians were gathered in groups of more than 3 for non-official or non-state sanctioned functions, that would be dispersed if it was found out about. And that was really done, one, as a method of social control, also so that Romanians wouldn't rely on each other, but would then therefore just have to rely on the government for everything. There are some people that we went to church with who told stories of having to take communion in wheat fields, like they'd be lying down in wheat fields and passing bread and wine to each other, totally out of sight so that nobody could see them and they wouldn't be punished. So I say all of that, again, this is a broad brush. There were many stories of resistance and people living some, I don't want to say a normal life because we all know that normal doesn't mean a whole lot. But some life that you could call happy, whole. But for the most part, people really were in want. People had a lot of money, but not a lot to spend on. People didn't have a lot of freedom to be who they were. Most Romanians who I know who were alive during that period said they could only feel like themselves when they would go out in the woods, out in the mountains, away from the ears of the secret police, and they could just be themselves. And then there are some sociologists that say that Romanians, along with a lot of other citizens of authoritarian regimes, have this learned helplessness when it comes to civic matters. Again, this is a broad brush. Many Romanians I know they're very strong actors in their communities, but there's a prevailing attitude of, that's not my problem. That's the government's problem to fix. It's somebody else's problem to fix. They made the mess, and so I'm not going to do it. And how that often comes out, that idea often comes out, is a phrase that I heard a lot, is asta e viața, that's life. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, so that's life, not a thing you can do about it. And this is built up, like I said, from this history, hundreds, thousands of years of being conquered. Again, very broad brush, but we're speaking in generalities here. Okay, so of course, everything boiled over in 1989. We can go to the next slide. Briefly, as I'm sure most of you remember, most of the Soviet bloc countries, they had revolutions in 1989 or leading up to 89. Romania's was the shortest and also the most violent. The protests started in the west of the country in a town called Timișoara. It was a vigil for a detained pastor that just grew in numbers. People really were just fed up with being controlled. So the vigil grew and grew and grew. And then once they met resistance, something was just tipping, and more people joined until hundreds of thousands of people were in the city center. And after a few days of that, the army sided with the people against the secret police. That spread to the rest of the country. Ceausescu was giving a speech on December 22nd, 89. He was booed and then detained. And then there were 3 days of a lot of violence in the capital city, Bucharest. Secret police made their last stand. And Nikolai and Elena were executed on live television on Christmas Day, 89, which kind of created this power vacuum, which a former communist filled happily under the guise of democracy. So in 89 and 90, about 1 million Romanians left Romania just to escape, get away, get to Western Europe, get to the States, get anywhere besides their oppressive homeland. And the 90s was pretty rough in Romania. There was a lot of food shortages, a lot of like organized crime, and a lot of former communists still controlling the government. Romania has been on this trend towards democracy. I think when we were there in 2014, there was a presidential election that a lot of people considered free and fair. Iohannis is still the president of Romania, and like, it's not super politically stable, but it is much more politically stable and people can live much freer and healthier lives there. So all that to be said, what the heck was this white guy from Kent, Ohio doing in Romania? Let me get there. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so my wife and I, we were long-term volunteers with an organization called New Horizons Foundation. New Horizons was started by an American couple who had been working in Massachusetts doing experiential and outdoor education. So basically working on ropes courses and leading backpacking trips for college students. His parents were living and working in Romania, and they kind of just had this idea that the breakdown in trust that a lot of Romanians were experiencing like a possible small solution could be what happens on ropes courses. You know, think like trust falls and team building activities and people doing really scary things in a very controlled, safe environment. And therefore, like learning to trust themselves and the people who are keeping them safe by holding them on a rope up 30 feet in the air. So they built a ropes course in 99, which turned into a summer camp. The summer camp is called Viața, which means life. If you recognize that word, it's from Asta Viața, that's life. Which is a really great name for a camp because one, it kind of mimics a condensed version of life where you're like meeting new people and you're challenging yourself and you're having a lot of fun and things are hard and fun and interesting. And then you're like kind of jazzed up to go and live the rest of your life differently. Also, it was very explicitly used to be a counter to Asta Viața. Kids would come in, they would ask the question like, how many people here think that you can make a difference in your community? And virtually nobody would raise their hands. After a week at camp where they're like practicing working together and like taking risks and taking initiative, almost everybody's hand would go up. So cool camp. I was the assistant director there for 5 years. I got to do lots of fun things like supervising our ropes course. You can go to the next slide. I led a lot of group games. You can go to the next slide. Went on a lot of beautiful hikes in the Carpathians. Next slide. Led some silly campfire songs because you got to do that at camp. You can go to the next slide. And then also did some ropes course maintenance and installation while I was there. So Viața was great. The camp was going really well for 7 or 8 years, I think. When some of the campers talked to the founders and said, hey, so like we love this camp, but for the other 51 weeks of our year, we really want to be putting this stuff into practice. Can you help us? So they formed these clubs called impact clubs, which were based on teenagers who had been at Viața, getting together and doing service learning, where they would plan a project. They would like look for issues in their community, find assets in the community, and then they would try to solve the problems. So they started very simply by like installing a porta potty in a national park. We'd do a lot of trash pickups, and then stuff got more and more interesting, like campaigns against semi-legal drugs and like throwing huge fundraising concerts to benefit local orphanages and local organizations. So my wife Kelly and I, we actually got to lead an impact club for about 4 years, from 2014 to 2018. You can go to the next slide. Yeah, okay, so service learning. Because Rotary is all about service, I really wanted to talk a bit about service learning. So I'm just gonna read what I wrote. What's interesting about service learning is that it's a hyphenated word, which means that the service is dependent on the learning and the learning is dependent on the service. You can't really have them both without each other. So service learning means that the service you perform or the services you perform are informed by what you learn about the community you do service with or the community you're service for. Service learning also means that your learning is necessarily tied to acting on what you learn for the good of your community. It's not just learning in a vacuum, it's doing something with your knowledge. And it also disrupts the status quo of both service and learning. It makes them a lot more holistic and useful. The way that showed up, I'll just use our club as an example. So you can go to the next slide. This is our impact club. Most of them joined when they were in 5th grade. So imagine myself and my wife with a bunch of 10-year-olds trying to figure out what we're going to do in our community. They wanted to start small, much like we did. So you can go to the next slide. And the first project that we did was responding to the problem of kids spending too much time on their phones and computers and playing video games. A lot of the kids were like, okay, so our classmates, they don't really play outside anymore. We don't want to play outside anymore. So let's make something happen so that people play outside. So what we did was we set up an afternoon of competitions and games in the park. And about 50 kids showed up randomly. Like they did a little bit of recruiting in their school and then kids came out. You can go to the next slide. This is us being very proud of ourselves, a bunch of 11-year-olds being very proud that they were actually leaders amongst their peers, and me and Kelly being very proud that we successfully supervised 50 kids in Romanian for a whole afternoon during the hot, hot sun. So it was a pretty simple project, but if you go to the next slide, this is our diagram where we actually planned out who was going to do what we had to do, what we needed to do it, when we were going to do it. We did this with 11-year-olds and they loved it. Like they loved doing this. So impact wasn't just about like doing things and learning from your community, but it's a resume builder as well. Like these kids now know a little bit about project planning and getting community buy-in. I don't want to like sugarcoat it and say that they're like going to be the next generation of community developers, but they could be if they continued with it. So yeah, our projects progressed as our kids got a little bit older and we learned more about the community. So if you go to the next slide, this is them. Oh, it's kind of dark. This is a Romanian schoolroom. This is them giving some presentations on anti-violence in their schools. So they asked their principal which classrooms had the most incidences with violence. And so then they did a little presentation, a little spiel that was, the basic gist was violence isn't cool. Watch out for people calling each other names because that typically will lead to fights. And once you beat somebody up, you can't take it back. So in the next slide, you can see that they were super intimidated to get up front of a lot of kids who get in fights and say, hey, beating each other up isn't cool. But what is cool is that a few weeks after they gave these presentations, the principal actually brought 2 kids who had been fighting to our kids and said, hey, they've been fighting. Can you please talk to them? Like, can you mediate the conflict? And they did, as 12-year-olds can. If you go to the next slide, to counteract kind of the like nervous energy and the nerdy vibes that they were giving off in the presentation, they also got a grant and they commissioned a painting from a local graffiti artist. So what it says there is, verbal violence makes you ugly. And it's got lots of curse words coming out of this face. So they put this up in the schoolyard. And I kid you not, like the next week after they'd put it up, the kids came to the Impact Club and said, everybody thinks that we're awesome because we got a graffiti up in the schoolyard. Like big self-esteem boost. And like kids were just talking about it for a long time. As far as I know, it's still up there in this backwater little schoolyard. And then if you go to the next slide, yeah, so this is my favorite project we did. There's a lot of trash on the streets in Lupeni, which is a shame because it's a really beautiful place and a lot of that trash gets in the river and then flows down the river into the Danube and then into the Black Sea and just sucks. Trash in waterways is terrible. So what our kids wanted to do was they wanted to go through the city and look for places of trash buildup. And they also wanted to implement recycling. So what they did was they lobbied the city to do that. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that they actually like made a huge map of the entire city and then got somebody from the mayor's office to come and listen to their proposal, which he did. And he said, okay, I can do some of this. And then here's the sad reality where I can't implement recycling yet, but we're working on it. We're on our way. So it was a great learning moment for him, knowing that citizens of the town, like even kids, really wanted things to change. And he got a specific proposal, but then also really great for us and for our kids to learn like how slowly some local government stuff can work, especially one that's like coming out of a pretty corrupt mayoral system. So all that to be said, impact clubs were a really great way for local youth to feel a sense of agency and empowerment and to implement service learning in their communities, to disrupt the status quo of like just complaining about a problem and then living with it and then like passing the blame to somebody else. They actually did something about it or like found somebody who could do something about it. Not perfect, didn't always work out the way we wanted it to, but it was a really great builder. So if you go to the next slide, I just want to tell you very quickly about what, oh goodness, we had a lot of fun with our impact kids. We went on picnics. If you go to the next slide, we had some Halloween parties. Halloween's an imported holiday, but we enjoyed it nonetheless. And then we also dragged kids along on hikes. And yeah, if you go to the next slide. Yeah, so like we got to know these kids over 4 years and they're awesome people with all their flaws and quirks and dreams and desires and whatever. So yeah, it was a really good time. So if you go to the next slide, my wife, I just want to tell you what she did. When we moved to Romania in 2013, there were some organizations in about 4 other countries around the world who had heard of the impact model. We had a whole curriculum, that New Horizons had a whole curriculum built out for like 3 years of impact club meetings. And they were trying to figure out how to implement impact in their own contexts so that they could use it as a tool for youth and community development. So when Kelly joined, she joined to be the partnership coordinator for Impact International. When we moved there, it was in 4 countries. And then when we moved away in 2018, it was in 25 countries. So lots of organizations, World Vision, and a lot of other similarly faith-based community development organizations were picking this up as a model for youth development. So yeah, she got to travel a lot and lead a lot of trainings. You can go to the next slide. Trainings where adults would wear silly hats, all for youth development and community development. So that's what we did. We moved back to the States in 2018. And now comes the part where I give you a few takeaways. So I really just have 2 takeaways that I wanted to share with you all that I have come to feel pretty very strongly about in the time that we lived there and then now moved back. So if you go to the next slide, maybe you've heard the joke where the fish comes to another fish and said, "Hey, how's the water?" And the other fish says, "What water? What's water?" When we grow up in a place, it's hard to see the water we're swimming in. It's hard to see the culture that surrounds us. It's hard to see what's normal and what's not normal. So obviously living in a different country for 5 years, I learned a lot of things that I thought were normal just because they're normal here in the States in Northeast Ohio are not normal in the rest of the world. For instance, like if you go down to Acme just down the road, you'll see so many options for cereal, canned tomatoes, beans. Most grocery stores in Romania are not like that. You have like 2 options and that's enough because you don't need 500 different kinds of beans. Another thing that's pretty normal here and was not super normal there is lawns that we keep looking nice by mowing them and spreading pesticides and actually harming lots of the other living creatures around us. In Romania, most people use their yards for growing food, or it's just as it was when the house was made and birds can live there, insects can live there. There are bigger differences that I also came away with, where like a lot of Romanians would say that when there's a societal problem, it's the government's responsibility to fix that. In the US, we have a bit more of an individual or a community-based idea that like we can volunteer our time. We can be individual agents and we can kind of take control of our fate. Systems of oppression are set up differently. In Romania, there's a lot of oppression and discrimination against gypsies, Roma, and like the system is set up that way. And it was very stark to me as a foreigner, where I see like, wow, you cannot get a job because you are a gypsy. In the US, our system is set up to benefit white people and to disparage non-white people. And we're working on it, but it just gave me new eyes to be able to see that a lot more clearly as a white person who grew up benefiting from all of that. So yeah, it was really important for me to realize like I am swimming in water. We're all swimming in water and we just can't see it most of the time. So yeah, that's one takeaway. And then the second takeaway is if you're going to serve, do service learning. I know Rotary is all about service. And I would really encourage you all to like look up service learning, Google it. John Dewey was one of the first people who talked about service learning as a way of education. It's in a lot of colleges, lots of organizations use it. Basically put, if you're going to serve a community or serve a person, especially if you have more economic, social, political power than they do, you got to know what you're doing. You got to know who you're serving. You got to know who you are meeting and what their problems are. And you will benefit from learning about them. It's a two-way street when you do service learning and not just service. And I've heard wonderful examples of that in Rotary clubs. And I encourage you to keep up with that. So that's all I have. Are we doing questions or a response or?
People want to stick around after if you do some questions. Jack, as you may know, thank you so much. It sounds like you need to become a Rotarian too. And this program is great. My father-in-law and mother-in-law are actually Romanian. If you want to have a never a dull moment, find yourself a father-in-law who grew up in Romania and fled Ceausescu. Never a dull conversation. It's a tradition in our club to have a responder. We were going to have Mary Beth Harper, who I think is going to pass it on to our special guest today, Adina.
Hello, I'm Adina from Romania. I work as a teacher. I've been working as a teacher for 12 years now, and I'm here on a project, a Fulbright teacher TEA, Excellence and Achievement Program. I'm very grateful for being here, and yes, I didn't know exactly I was going to be, going to have a speech, so I'm not prepared for that. But it was a pleasure having listened to your speech about Romania. It's interesting to see how people perceive Romania from the outside. I also had my own insights while hearing, your opinions about my country, and yeah, it was very emotional in one way. Also, I'm very happy to hear that you've been involved in these projects. I have also started my own NGO 3 years ago because I would like to change something to the Romanian system, educational system, and because I wanted to involve my students in other kind of projects, like involving them in non-formal educational type of projects. Erasmus Plus projects, maybe you have heard of them. People here have never heard of them. They are very popular in Romania, and we can apply for those grants, and we can take our students to different European countries. And I have done that with my students many times. We've gone to Spain many times, to Germany, and many other countries. So yeah, I don't know what else should I add. If you have any questions, I don't know. Yeah. So, okay. Thank you too. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right. If anyone wants to learn more about Romania, Jack's going to hang around. He'll tell you all about Mama Liga and other Romanian foods. We don't have it up, but do it from memory. We're going to repeat the 4-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.